Hello and welcome to this masterclass on English language, paper 1. We are starting off with questions 1 and 2. So we're making sure that we're confident with the format of paper 1 section A and making sure that we know how to structure our answers. And in order to make sure that we know how to do that, we're going to be focusing on one extract across the 3 masterclasses that are available. So we'll be coming back to this success criteria once we are ready to answer the question. You can see here the makeup of paper 1. So there's 4 reading questions and the 1 writing question. The reading questions being worth 40 marks and the writing question worth 40 marks. And you can see that today we are going to be working on question 2, language analysis, worth 8 marks. This is exactly the same skill and question and mark scheme as question 3 in paper 2. So it's really important that you know how to confidently analyse language. We're also going to touch on question 1 today. That's a nice easy one, but it's always good to practice. Okay, so we are going to be using an extract from a novel called The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. The narrator is a teenage girl who has been murdered, and she's speaking to us from the afterlife. And before we answer questions 1 to 4, it's really important that we make sure we know the text inside out. So whilst I read the extract, can you make some notes on what is happening, who the characters are, and what you feel it's about? Try to summarise the extract as I'm reading it. You can access this extract via your Google Classroom. Your teacher should have posted it in there under revision materials. But also I will pop it up on the screen as well. So have a little think as I'm reading about these questions here. Okay, let's have a read. The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold, published 2002. The extract below is the opening of a novel. The narrator is a teenage girl who has been murdered. My name was Salmon, like the fish. First name, Susie. I was 14 when I was murdered on December 6, 1973. In newspaper photos of missing girls from the 70s, most looked like me. White girls with mousy brown hair. This was before kids of all races and genders started appearing on milk cartons or in the Daily Mail. It was still back when people believed things like that didn't happen. In my junior high yearbook was a quote from a Spanish poet my sister had turned me onto, Juan Ramon Jimenez. It went like this: if they give you ruled paper, write the other way. I chose it both because it expressed my contempt for my structured surroundings a la the classroom, and because, not being some dopey quote from a rock group, I thought it marked me as literary. I was a member of the chess club and chem club and burned everything I tried to make in Mrs. Delminico's home economics class. My favourite teacher was Mr. Bott, who taught biology and liked to animate the frogs and crawfish we had to dissect by making them dance in their waxed pans. I wasn't killed by Mr. Bott, by the way. Don't think every person you're going to meet in here is a suspect. That's the problem, you never know. Mr. Bott came to my memorial, as, may I add, did almost the entire junior high school. I was never so popular. And cried quite a bit. He had a sick kid. We all knew this, so when he laughed at his own jokes, which were rusty way before I had him, we laughed too, forcing it sometimes just to make him happy. His daughter died a year and a half after I did. She had leukemia. I never saw her in my heaven. The murderer was a man from our neighbourhood. My mother liked his border flowers, and my father talked to him once about fertiliser. My murderer believed in old-fashioned things like eggshells and coffee grounds, which he said his own mother had used. My father came home smiling, making jokes about how the man's garden might be beautiful, but it would stink to high heaven once a heatwave hit. But on December 6, 1973, it was snowing, and I took a shortcut through the cornfield back from junior high. It was dark out because the days were shorter in winter, and I remember how the broken cornstalks made my walk more difficult. The snow was falling lightly, like a flurry of small hands, and I was breathing through my nose until it was running so much that I had to open my mouth. 6 feet from where Mr. Harvey stood, I stuck my tongue out to taste the snowflake. "Don't let me startle you," Mr. Harvey said. Of course, in a cornfield in the dark, I was startled. After I was dead, I thought about how there had been the light scent of cologne in the air, but that I had not been paying attention or thought it was coming from one of the houses up ahead. "Mr. Harvey," I said, "you're the older Salmon girl, right?" "Yes." "How are your folks?" Although the eldest in my family and good at acing a science quiz, I'd never felt comfortable with adults. "Fine," I said. I was cold, but the natural authority of his age and the added fact that he was a neighbour and had talked to my father about fertiliser rooted me to the spot. "I've built something back here," he said. "Would you like to see?" "I'm sort of cold, Mr. Harvey," I said, "and my mum likes me home before dark." "It's after dark, Susie," he said. I wished now that I had known this was weird. I had never told him my name. Okay, so that's our extract. Before we begin, I just want to clarify a couple of things. So first of all, she's writing this about life in the 70s, okay? She was murdered in 1973, and it is set in America. We can tell that because it talks about junior high and a yearbook. When she refers to Chem Club, she's talking about Chemistry Club, which I guess could indicate that she's quite clever in chess club, but she felt like she wasn't very good at cooking. Home economics class is cooking class, okay? She talks to us about her favourite teacher. I'm just seeing if there's anything else that we might not know. So a cornfield is where sweet corn is grown. It has very high, tall stems. Might have seen those before. I think that's everything that would be confusing. Okay, so how did you get on? Did you manage to make a note of who the characters are and what you feel the text is about? I want us to go into a little bit more detail now and see if you can do the 5 W's in response to this text. So who is the main character or narrator? Where is the extract set? When is it set? Do we have a sense of time period, day, time of year, and what happens in each paragraph? And then if you can, have a think about why the writer is giving us this information. Pause this video now and have a go at those questions in the red bullet points, please. Okay, let's see how you got on. So, who? Susie Salmon. She's 14 years old. She's dead. She's a first-person narrator. References to yearbook, junior high, and mum suggest American setting and mentions a cornfield, so perhaps a rural or isolated location. The date of the murder tells us it was December 1973, and we can also get that feel of winter with the snow falling, shorter days, shows us that it's cold. And then we've got the what happens across the text. So we find out she's dead. She talks about her school days and what she enjoyed about them. We get information on her favourite teacher, not her murderer. The revelation of murderer and her parents' relationship with him, so who the murderer is and that her parents knew him. And finally, at the end, recounts her death and like the day that she died. We're thinking about why the author might have given us this information. Well, it's odd information to give that the novel opens with the dead girl narrating, which suggests that why she died and who the murderer is isn't the point of the novel, and maybe that she wants to shock the reader. This contextual information is really important because when you start to analyse, you want to start to think about why the author is doing things. Okay, so it's important that we think about the who, what, when, where, why, because that's going to help us put the things that we start to pick out in context. Okay, so question 1. You are asked to read lines 1 to 5 and list 4 details from this part of the text that we learn about the narrator. The first thing you should do when you see question 1 is box off the line numbers that you are asked to focus on. The number one mistake that people make on this question is picking out the information from the wrong part of the text. So please, in your extract, highlight or put a box around those lines, and then pause this video and have a go at picking out 4 details that we learn about the narrator. Okay, how did we get on? You could have had, her name is Susie Salmon, she was murdered, she was 14 when she was murdered, the date of her death is December the 6th, 1973, she is white, she has mousy brown hair. So those are your answers for question 1. We're now going to move on to question 2. So question 2 focuses on language analysis. Read again lines 9 to 16. How does the writer use language here to describe Mr. Bott? You should comment on interesting words and phrases, language features and techniques. Okay, so first of all, we need to box off. We always book the questions. We want to box off lines 9 to 16. Okay, so find those in your extract and draw a box around them, or if you're working online, highlight those lines. Just make sure you do not answer this question with anything that's not in lines 9 to 16, because you will not get marked for it, even if you write really brilliant stuff. Has to come from lines 9 to 16. Okay, the next thing to do is to underline the keywords in this question. So if it was me doing this, I would underline how, language, and Mr. Bott. How, language, Mr. Bott. Okay, above how, I personally would write the word methods, because that is reminding us that for this question, we need to be able to pick out the methods that the author uses to describe Mr. Bott. That's the how, it's the methods, the language techniques. Okay, so above how, always write methods, because that reminds you, one of the things in the success criteria for this question is to make sure that you are using subject terminology, which would be labeling the methods. Speaking of methods then, what kind of things would we be looking for? In that bullet point, we've got interesting words and phrases, but also language features and techniques. Can you pause this video now and make a list of all of the language features and techniques that you can think of that you might be able to pick out? Okay, how did we do? What language techniques did you come up with? You could have had things like simile, metaphor, personification, pathetic fallacy, word types such as verbs or adjectives, imagery, and you can break imagery down into the type of imagery that you get. So for example, imagery related to sounds or smells or taste or feel, onomatopoeia, emotive language, semantic fields, any of these types of things. That's not an exhaustive list. You might have thought of some more, and good for you if you have. Okay, so we know what we're looking out for. However, our focus in this question, our job in this question is not to feature spot. The job isn't to just pick out the language features. Our focus in this question is how language is used to describe Mr. Bott. Okay, so we're on lines 9 to 16. Let's have a look at lines 9 to 16 and see what we can find. So here I am. Here's line 9. Whoa. Line 9 starts here. I'm going to put it in bold so I know. And 16 is here. All of that in bold. And that's just going to make sure that I'm not looking anywhere other than here. Okay, so my favourite teacher was Mr. Bott. Let me remind myself, the question is asking me how is language used to describe Mr. Bott. Okay. He taught biology. He liked to animate the frogs and crawfish we had to dissect by making them dance in their waxed pans. So it's good to know that that's her favourite teacher. That's helpful information about Mr. Bott. Okay, he taught biology and he liked to animate the frogs and crawfish by making them dance. These things that I'm highlighting are things that are giving me information about Mr. Bott. Mr. Bott came to Susie's memorial and cried quite a bit. He had a sick child. So he laughed at his own jokes. That's interesting to know about Mr. Bott. And those jokes were rusty. So she means like old-fashioned or not very funny. And they laughed, forcing it sometimes, for goodness sake, forcing it sometimes just to make him happy. His daughter died. Right. All of this information that I've highlighted now is to do with Mr. Bott. Okay. Not all of it is going to give me a lot to say. So I now need to think about what I want to pick out that's actually going to give me something to analyse. So for example, the fact that Mr. Bott taught biology doesn't tell me that much about him. But the fact that he liked to animate the frogs and crawfish by making them dance, and the fact that he laughed at his own jokes, which were rusty, does tell me things about his personality. I can infer from that. I can infer from the fact that they laughed too, forcing it to make him happy. These are not language techniques. Because I can't see a simile or a metaphor, I'm not going to label a language technique, but I could say the phrase. You might say it's emotive language to tell us that he went to the memorial and cried and he had a sick kid and his daughter died, because that might make us feel sorry for Mr. Bott. Okay, so when I'm thinking about how I'm going to answer this question, I then want to think about which bits that I've picked out that look at the focus are actually going to be useful for me. And you might have noticed then the next step in that is how you group those together. Okay. Then, once we've decided what evidence we're going to use, we then need to think about what we're going to say about the evidence. So when we answer this question, we need to be thinking about the effect on the reader. And for that, we use the acronyms MATE, QUIF, and RULE. So these are all things that you can say happen to the reader as a result of the language. So by telling us that Mr. Bott used to make jokes and make the frogs dance, you could say that creates a tone of respect and love for Mr. Bott, or an atmosphere of happiness of what it was like to be in his classroom. Okay, you might say it helps the reader to understand why Susie Salmon liked Mr. Bott. it helps the reader to realise what sort of person Mr. Bott is. Okay, so I'm being specific in what I say after the quiff, rule or make. I'm not just saying it makes the reader feel something, helps the reader to imagine Mr. Bott. That's too general. We need to be specific. When we come on to answer the question, this structure at the bottom of the slide is the really helpful one. Okay, so these are like your sentence starters. So the author creates, and you'll notice up here, we always start our point with the author creates an impression of, or the author creates a sense that Mr. Bott is. And then you're starting your analysis straight away. If you just go in with the author writes about Mr. Bott, you're not saying anything that could pick you up a mark. But if you say the author creates the impression that Mr. Bott is a nice man, you're saying something that you've learned. So you're going to get a tick straight away. Then use your evidence. Now, as we know from the mark scheme, the more specific your evidence is, the higher your mark is likely to be. And if you can use multiple quotes, then that would be good. Then infer what the quote suggests. If you can, infer again. Then this is the key. Zoom in and do connotations and quiff, rule or mate on a specific word. That's what moves you into level 3 of the mark scheme for that clear analysis. And then you need to link back to the question or the author's intentions. So the zoom in, connotations and quiff are the absolute must to get you into level 3 of the mark scheme. If you do the first 4 steps and don't do the zoom in and connotations and quiff, you will be limited to band 2. Likewise, if you miss out the inference and just go to the connotations, you will struggle because you're not explaining where your ideas are coming from. Okay, so let's have a look. We've got our extract, we've highlighted our key evidence. Now let's think about what we can say about them. So, for example, in the interesting words and phrases, he liked to animate the frogs and make them dance. He laughed at his own jokes. Inference would be that it suggests a lively teacher who tried to engage students through humour in lessons. Maybe the fact that he cried quite a bit could suggest he cares a lot about the children he teaches. If you're aiming for higher marks, look at this one for zooming in. So the evidence here is judicious because they've just picked out all of the verbs: animate, dance, cried, laughed. And these all show us what sort of person he is. That he's really, I guess, kind and cares about his job. Okay, the language technique. My favourite teacher, we've got that descriptive noun phrase. Again, if you wouldn't know to call that a descriptive noun phrase, you can just say the phrase or Susie's opinion. That's absolutely fine and would get you a mark. She calls him my favourite teacher, which shows that she feels attached to him. And you could talk about the fact that she emphasises that she wasn't killed by Mr. Bott, because that tells us that we can trust him and that he's a kind man. But just be careful that you still stay focused on Mr. Bott and then don't start talking about Susie. Okay, so using the language features you've annotated or the ideas we've just shared there, I now want you to spend 10 minutes. I'm going to leave this structure up, pause this video, spend 10 minutes and try and answer the question: how does the author use language to describe Mr. Bott? We've got our evidence, we've labelled the methods if we could, and we've talked about how to answer the question. Okay, so now I want you to have a go at answering the question using these structures to help you. Time yourself, aim for 3 paragraphs if you can. 10 minutes, off you go. Okay, let's have a look how you got on. Here is the mark scheme. The mark scheme is looking for you to comment on the effect of language. That's why we're using quiff, rule and mate. Select appropriate textual detail, which is why we're making sure that we found quotes in the text, and to use some use of subject terminology, which is why we're trying to label the methods or use the word or the phrase. To move up into band 3, the difference is how well you explain the effects. It moves from an attempt to comment to explaining clearly the effect of writer's choice of language. A range of textual detail. So using a number of quotes, not just one per paragraph, and maybe using 2 or 3 per paragraph, or across the whole of your answer, maybe 4 or 5 quotes in total. And clear and accurate use of subject terminology. And again, to move up to 7 or 8, it's just about the level of detail. So could you go into more detail in your analysis? And grouping those words, like we picked out the verbs, for example, would be a more judicious textual detail. They're really selective is what judicious means. They're really focused on getting the exact bit that's impacting them. Okay, so with that in mind, think about what you've done and where you think you currently are. Let's look at a waggle, what a good one looks like, to see how it works in practice. And you will see in this waggle, I have coloured this to be the same as each step of these circles down here, okay? The author creates an impression of Mr. Bott as a likeable character. She says he liked to animate frogs and laughed at his own jokes, which suggests he was a fun teacher who cared about his students. The narrator says sometimes the students forced to laugh just to make him happy, which shows he was very well liked and the students cared about him too. Animate and laughed indicates he was lively and vibrant and reinforces why the narrator liked him. The author wants the reader to understand Susie's relationship with the teacher is positive and to reveal more about the type of character Susie is by showing us the kind of people she respected. Okay, so you can see in this answer, my point immediately would get a tick for analysis because I've said the author creates an impression of Mr. Bott as a likeable character. I'm saying what I think of Mr. Bott because of what has been written. He is a likeable character. I've then used 2 quotes. He liked to animate frogs and he laughed at his own jokes. And here comes my inference, which suggests he was a fun teacher who cared about his students. Now, at this point, I was like, I don't really have anything else to say for an inference 2. So he liked to animate frogs and he laughed at his own jokes. It shows he's a fun teacher. I don't really know what else to say. So rather than miss out that step, I added in another quote. The narrator says, sometimes the students forced to laugh just to make him happy. That's my quote. And then I can add my second inference, which shows he was very well liked and the students cared about him too. I couldn't just say the students cared about him too, because the evidence that I've put does support that, okay? The evidence like to have his own jokes tells us what sort of teacher Mr. Bott is. But when it says that the children want to make him happy, it shows that he's well, so I can build him more improvement in another quote. All the time, I'm using evidence to show where my ideas have come from. Then I've got my new animate and laugh indicate he was lively and vibrant and reinforces why the narrator liked him. Okay, really clear, those words, what the connotations are, he was lively and vibrant, and then why they've been used, reinforces, that's rule, why the reader liked him. Then I've got my author's intentions. The author wants the reader to understand Susie's relationship with the teacher is positive and feel more about the type of character Susie is by showing the kind of people she respected. The author wants the reader to understand Susie's relationship with the teacher is positive This reveals more about the type of character Susie is because it shows us the kind of people she expects. So we learn about Susie through what she said about Mr. Ross. Okay, if you have put in your circle, in your answer, how inference, you would be on a level 1 to 2. If you've managed to do 2 inferences or 1 inference in a quiz, you'd be moving into level 2 in that scheme. It is the zoom-in that moves you into level 3, and that focus attention that would move this into level 4. Now that's only 1 paragraph, so that you would need to have more than that. But just as a bit what your analysis should look like, that is what you are aiming for. So what can you do with this information now? Well, there are 2 tasks that you could do next. The first thing could be to redraft your answer and try and see, using the waggle, what you do to build up more detail in your analysis. If you're happy with the answer, or you feel like actually there's just not that much to say on this about, why not go into your Google Classroom, find a paper, and have a go at the question 2, and try and apply the skills that we talked about today. Give Mark Scheme a reminder. I hope that's been really helpful for you. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got questions, feel free to email me or your English teacher. Do feel free to drop me an email and say, thanks guys, I'd love to hear that. It's been helpful for you. Have a go, follow up on it. Don't just sit and do nothing now. Go, try again. Learn from what you've just done in this assessment, okay? Next session is on question 3 and structure.